The best way to get started with Azure Remote Rendering is by visiting the developer documentation. We're always keeping it up to date. We take a lot of pride in the docs, and there's sample projects in there as well. So from a quick start that you can deploy to Unity and upload your model and get it all running within about 30 minutes to a showcase that's more of a commercial type scenario where you can have a user interface and gesture support via MRTK. So you can see those two starting points. The other thing that's really cool is it's called the ART tool, and it's the Azure Remote Rendering tool. And it's a desktop binary. It's pre-compiled if you want to just download the executable. All you do is plug in your account credentials and hit start, and you can see any content that you've uploaded remotely, or you can see the kind of built-in assets if you need to get started even quicker than deploying a Unity project.
Hello there and welcome to my session, What You Need to Know About 3D Assets as an XR Dev at this year's Global XR Conference. So before we start, I want to make sure everyone knows what the session is about and what to expect. So during my career and then when working with Unity and as an XR developer, I just came to realize that it's very important to know at least some basics about how 3D assets are working, what textures are, and how UV maps work. And essentially, also, it doesn't really hurt to know your way around Blender, for example. So you can just make some minor modifications yourself. You don't have to be a 3D artist, but it just helps if you can do some stuff on your own without having to request a 3D artist to change a simple thing and so on and so forth. So it really does help. That said, I myself am not a 3D artist. So if you are a 3D artist, then you might scream in agony during this session because of the things I say, but it's just from a developer's perspective, and I think it's not too bad actually. So you can expect from today's session that you will learn some of the keywords, some of the basics about 3D assets, and from there you can take that and move on and try to deepen your knowledge a little bit. I won't go into a lot of details because of the time restriction of this session, but you should be able, having this session and Google and the internet and YouTube in general, you should be able to get more details about everything I tell you today. So without any further ado, let's get started and take a look at 3D assets. All right. So what you can see right now is the default Blender view. I'm using the latest version 3.3. I believe, and I just deleted the default camera and light it creates, but don't worry about that too much. What we are seeing is just a cube, and this is essentially a 3D asset. It's a very primitive 3D asset, but it helps whatever you are working on. Just remember, it's essentially the same, be it a cube or some super complex 3D mesh, some high poly character or whatever. It all boils down to the same topics, same analogies. It's just more complex. So let's start out with this cube. It looks quite similar to Unity, if you will. So as you can see, this cube, it has 6 faces, no surprise here. And if we now select it here, again, this is not about Blender. I will be using Blender here, but if you want to learn Blender, there's plenty of other channels for that. I recommend Grant Abbott. He does a great bunch of tutorials on Blender that are really beginner friendly. So I selected this cube using my left mouse, and now that I have selected it, I can switch into edit mode. And now I'm in edit mode, and I'm doing this to show you what this cube is made of, right? So using number 1 on my keyboard, I can enable vertex selection. And a vertex is essentially these small dots that you can see at the corners of the cube. So each face on the 3D mesh is made up of multiple vertexes. Now, what's a face? If I press 3 on my keyboard, for example, I can select faces, and these are the faces of the cube, right? And those faces, if we go back to vertex selection, now they are made up of 1, 2, 3, 4 vertices, right? And that's essentially, if you combine them, if you connect them, then you get the outline of the face, right? And there's another thing called edge, which is these edges that I can also select, and if I want, manipulate, but we don't want to do that right now. So again, we have vertices and we have edges, and then they together, vertices and edges, they create faces. And right now what we are seeing here is a quad. So a quad is a face that's made up of more than 3 vertices. So if I enable statistics right here in Blender, then you can see this total object, the cube, it has 8 vertices, it has 12 edges, and it has 6 faces. And it says it has 12 triangles. Now, what's a triangle? A tris or triangle is the shape every face has at the end of the day, you know. So I was trying to find the right word, but let's take a look. So this face right here, if you cut it in half, then what you get is this. So you have now here a tris and here a tris, and they together combined make up that square shape, the quad, right? And any 3D engine, real-time 3D engine, most of them will actually take your 3D mesh and what we call triangulate them. They will modify them so that they are only made up of triangles, right? So that's why this cube, it does have 6 faces, but it has 12 triangles. If we cut each of the faces in half, we end up with 12 triangles. And it's important to keep this metric in mind, because you will be hearing it a lot when working with 3D assets. Oh, how many polys does it have? It has 600 quads, or I don't know, 1,200 tris triangles, and so on and so forth. So it's an indicator for the complexity of the 3D object. Now, what I did here is just to show you, I exported this cube. I haven't done anything to it. I just exported it as it is and imported it into Unity. And now if I put this in my scene, which I already did, this is what it looks like. No surprise here. Still looks the same. But if I switch into wireframe shading here in the editor, then you can see actually that Unity, when importing the asset, went and triangulated it. It just cut all of the quads until it was only composed of triangles, right? And that's so I'm telling you this because that means for you, when you are creating your asset in Blender or some other 3D software, you don't have to worry about triangulating it. You can actually do that. You can select the whole thing and triangulate it right inside Blender. And as you can see, I now have only triangles. But in general, when working with 3D assets, it's much harder to work with a triangulated asset than with a asset that consists of quads. So you want to keep those quads. Of course, there's ways to undo triangulation to a certain degree, but it will always be much easier for you to work with quads. And you don't have to worry about triangulating it. Unity will do that for you when importing. So now we have seen this cube and we know what it's made up of. We can now identify what these metrics mean. We know what a vertex is. We know what an edge is. An edge always combines two vertices. We know what a face is, and we also know what triangles are. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about are normals. I'm pretty sure you have heard about normals. It's the one thing that keeps coming up when talking about 3D assets. And it's actually, from my experience, the cause of many issues you might have as someone that's new to 3D assets and just imported some asset that someone sent you and then something doesn't look right. And it's very often about the normals. So what are these? We are back in Blender here, and a normal is a vector that's pointing away from the face. It's perpendicular to the face and 90 degrees like this. And it's pointing away from the surface. So if you take, for example, this face right here, then the normal is pointing upwards and it's centered in the face. So actually, each vertex on a mesh has a normal. But for now, let's focus on the face normals. They are the most important ones, in my opinion. And the face normals are actually made up as an average normal of the vertex normals. So why is it important to know that? Because if we enable face orientation visualization in Blender right here, then we see all these blue faces. That means that all the normals are pointing outwards from the cube. So they are pointing not into the cube, they are pointing outwards of the cube. If I now select all of this and I can do flip normals, it turns red. And that means the normals are now pointing into the cube. If I now move the camera into the cube, then you can see that it's blue inside now. Once again, why is this important? Because the normals define from which side the faces are visible, essentially. So when rendering, then if you're normal, so if we were to render this cube right now using a standard shader in Unity, then we wouldn't see it. Actually, let's do that right away. So we can now select export FBX, for example, and export my cube flipped normals, right? Export, and then we go into Unity, and I can select import new asset and downloads my cube flipped normals. Now let's remove this cube, or actually let's keep it. This is the first one we had where I was talking about triangulation. Let's now get this one in here. And as you can see, it looks different. That's because the normals are flipped. We are now only seeing the faces where the normals are facing the camera. Not directly, but they are basically visible from the camera's point of view. And so I can only see these inside faces now, and as I rotate my camera around this cube, you notice how different faces appear. So this face is now visible, and if I keep on rotating, it will disappear next, because from the I should now be seeing the backside of that face. But using a standard shader, I won't be able to do that. Now there is shaders that do double-sided rendering, so they will render the face no matter where the normals are pointing, right? So it doesn't really matter. But that comes at some computational cost, of course, and you don't want to waste resources. But this might look familiar to you. This is actually a pretty common trick to create some, I don't know, photo boxes for rendering. For example, you can now put some other object in here and create some sort of photo box where you can look into the cube and see what's inside. Whereas with this one, where the normals are pointing outwards, I can't look into the cube. And now if I actually go inside this cube in Unity, then you see, I hope you were expecting this, we don't see the cube from inside, because from inside of this cube, all the normals are pointing away from the camera, they're pointing outwards, and that's why we don't see those faces, right? So let's return to Blender. So that's what normals are. They are vectors that are, each face has a normal, and that normal is pointing in either direction. It's either pointing into the face, it's pointing outside, into the outside direction, and that defines where you will be able to see that face or not. Now, here we flipped all of the normals, and a common thing is, let's flip them again and fix it basically. So this would be now a cube that works and that's visible from the outside. But someone sent you a cube, and then when you import it into Blender, Unity, I'm sorry, for some reason, you can't see the top of the cube, and you're just wondering what's going on. Then the first thing you should be thinking about is, oh, I should take a look at the normals and check if they are okay. So let's export this one more time, just real quick to demonstrate what I will now delete this cube that I just exported. I know it doesn't make sense, but I will now import it again. So let's say someone sent you this cube and you realized, oh, something's not looking right. And then what you have to do is you open it in Blender, and then you look at it and you enable face orientation, and you see, oh yeah, that face that I can see in Unity, it looks like the normal is flipped. So you can just fix that, flip the normal, export the cube again or your mesh, and it will look right inside Unity. And just like that, you fixed one of the most common things that may happen if you use some asset store meshes or some objects you found in the internet. To be fair, nowadays the general quality of meshes you can download for free here and there in the asset store, it's pretty good, but still you might run into these kind of issues, especially when someone used some automatic geometry reduction, or some tool was working on the 3D mesh and exported something. It can happen that normals are broken, and then you have to go and fix them, right? So that's what normals are about, and you should really learn to fix them. By the way, I mean it's a well-known fact, but I just want to mention that Blender is absolutely free to use. So and I think that makes it so great. It's such a powerful tool, and I love using it, and it's completely free. So I find it hard to believe, actually. It's I mean. I'm paying for Photoshop, I'm paying for this and that, Substance Painter, all of these also great softwares, but they come at a price, and Blender is just so powerful and it's free. So I can only recommend you start learning Blender, learning the basics, navigation inside Blender, and so on and so forth. All right, that concludes our talk about normals. Now that we know these kind of basics about 3D meshes. We know about what they're made up of. We know what a normal is. The next logical step, in my point of view, is that we look at UV maps. So what is a UV map? You have maybe heard that, you maybe have not, but it's something you really need to know because it's important for texturing, it's important for light baking in Unity. So we need to know what UV maps are. A UV map, as the name suggests, is a map from 2D space to 3D space, or the other way around, from 3D space to 2D space. It essentially tells us if I put a texture on this 3D asset, on this mesh, what part of the mesh can be found where on the texture. So what pixel on the texture graphic will appear at what spot on the 3D mesh. But when talking about textures, you will hear the term texels. So texels are essentially the pixel coordinates on a texture. So as you can see, the cube is gone because it just doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about UV maps using a cube. It's actually way too simple. And so I added this cylinder object here that makes a little bit more sense because it has a little more detail we can talk about. So now what we want to do is we want to apply some texture to this cylinder. We want to make it look more interesting, maybe give it a wooden look or write something onto it. Now, you could, of course, do all of that using geometry, but that's where things get very complex, right? So you want to save geometry by adding details using textures. Of course, textures also come at a cost, but usually you want to use textures, normal maps and such to add detail to your object without adding more geometry, without increasing the poly count of the object. So let's take a look at this cylinder, right? This cylinder, it doesn't have a UV map right now, or basically it does have one, but it's not optimized. It's the default UV map. You will see it in a minute. It just doesn't work right. Why is that? So let's export that cylinder. And now I have Substance Painter here, which is basically the Photoshop for 3D meshes. There's other solutions as well, but I happen to use Substance Painter. And now let's select the cylinder and create a new project in Substance Painter using that cylinder. So what you can see here now again is the cylinder, and to the right you can see that we have the UV map. So this is the current UV map of our cylinder. As you can see, to the left is the 3D world, and to the right is the 2D world. So this is a 2D graphic, and this is a 3D object, and somehow we want them. They are related, right? So, for example, similar to Photoshop, I have these layers here. I can now go ahead and say, look, I want this to be concrete, and I can drag this here. So let's see what this looks like. Okay, at this point, you might say, well, it doesn't look too bad. It's a little hard edges, but it looks okay. But what happens if I now, sorry, where was I? I want to create a new fill layer right here. Where is it? I'm sorry, I don't want to create a fill layer. I want to create a paint layer. I want to paint on these, on the object now. So if I now draw an X here, and now you are seeing where the issue is. I'm drawing an X on this texture, and it appears on all the faces of this cylinder, right? See this? Now, maybe that's what you want, then it's okay. It's actually something people sometimes do intentionally to save texture space. Then they overlap the faces on the texture, and you get the effect of having the same drawing on multiple faces on your 3D asset. But we don't want to do that right now. We actually want this X to only appear on a specific face of this cylinder. And we actually maybe want the top and the bottom to look differently. I don't know. Let's imagine. So how do we fix this? We have to create a UV map. We have to fix the UV map of this asset. Let's go back to Blender for now. And then up here, there is UV editing. And then we can see here, look, it looks quite similar to Substance Painter. So in this case, to the right, there's the 3D world, and to the left is the 2D world. I can select these arrows up here to enable sync of these two. And now I can see the faces. If I now select this right here, this face, actually it's if I select it like this, then you can see I selected this face. And again, the issue is already prominent that all the faces are located at the same location on the UV map. And that's why when I was drawing that X, and it appeared on all faces, because they are overlapping, they are stacked on each other. And then that way, when we draw on this texture, on this UV map, it will appear on all faces. So let's fix this. When UV mapping, when unwrapping an object, we want to bring it to the 2D space. We want to, essentially, I always like to imagine I have a pair of scissors, and then I cut the object so I can put it flat on a surface, and then it becomes 2D. So let's cut this cylinder. I want to select this edge. I want to select all of the edges actually at the top, all the way around, and I can say mark seam, right? And this marks them as a seam. That essentially tells Blender, please take your pair of scissors and cut the mesh along this red line. I want to do the same thing to the bottom. Now I told Blender, okay, cut it at the top, cut it at the bottom. And what's left now, if we unwrap this now, let's take a look. I press U, unwrap. It looks better already, right? But it's not perfect yet, because if we now imagine this cylinder to become flat, if we squeeze it, then we still have overlapping faces, right? So we cannot. It's not ready yet. So I can now enable right here display stretch. So this shows us this should be blue as well. If it's perfectly blue, that means that surface, it's not being stretched at all. Because if we squeeze it, if we have to squeeze something to flatten it, then there is tension. We have to press it, right? So we want to remove that stretch. And how do we do that? Well, it's pretty simple. In this case, all we have to do is make one more cut, for example, here, add another seam. And now we have fully unwrapped this object. Let's do unwrap again and see all the stretch is gone. We have now separated the top right here and the bottom right here. Actually, it's the other way around. So this is the bottom and this is the top. We have separated them into different objects on the UV map, basically islands on the UV map. So to the left on the texture, we can now see, oh yeah, this is the bottom. I can move that over here, for example. This is the top. I can move it over here. If I now expect to need more detail on the top of the cylinder, I can actually increase its size on the UV map like this. And that gives me more texels, more pixels on the texture to add details on the top. For example, if you want to draw something, write something, then whatever your texture resolution is, your texture resolution might be only 512 pixels square. you won't have much details and it will become blurry. But if you increase the surface size on the texture, then that gives you more texels, more pixels on your texture to add detail on that specific face. And all of these side faces, they are here, right? They're just a line basically, because what we did is we added a cut here. So imagine we removed top and bottom, and then we just made one more cut here along this edge, and that way the sides, they all were folded up out into one flat surface, right? So that's what you see here. And now we have a proper map from 2D space to 3D space. Now let's go and export this now again. Let's export the cylinder and return to Substance Painter. And I think I should be able to actually update the mesh without having to create a new project. Yeah, that's right here. I can select the updated cylinder, press OK. And now what you can see here is that it reloaded the mesh using the new export we made. And now to the right, we are seeing the right UV map we just created. So let's remove that drawing we made. Let's remove the concrete as well. So this is just the empty cube. There's not cylinder, I'm sorry, there's nothing on it. So now let's go ahead again and add some, I don't know, let's say we want this to be aluminum. And now if I add another painting layer and write A here, excuse my poor drawing, now you see that it only appears at the top surface. That's because we now have a proper UV map where the islands are separated, faces are not overlapping. In this case, we really want each face to have its own space on the texture UV map. So if we now do something like this, then you can see it will only appear on the faces that are relevant to that part of the texture. So this line here, it appeared here, and this line over here is actually crossing multiple faces. We can continue that like this, like a scratch. And so just like that, we added a scratch to that surface. But we can now do whatever we want because all the faces are separated. Now, same thing, if you wanted actually to have all your surfaces to be the same, have the same texture, then you could not, of course, overlap these and stack them on one another, and then you just have to create one drawing and it will look the same on each side of the cylinder. And now this is the bottom. I mean, of course it's gonna work, you know, but look, I just added another X at the bottom and it's at the bottom. That means that's UV maps for you. So what we now did is we took a broken UV map and then we fixed it by unwrapping the object and adding the needed information so the engine or Blender or Substance Painter knows how can I translate from 2D space to 3D space and the other way around. And now this is your texture, and whatever you add into normal map or base texture slot in Unity, this is the UV map it will be using. And it actually can use this UV map also for light baking, and I will show you that in a minute. So this concludes a very fast and rough look at UV maps. I hope you are still with me. I know it's a lot to digest and I'm moving pretty fast, but don't worry, at the end there will be a short summary with all the keywords and buzzwords that we covered, and then from there you can take that and dive deeper in separate sessions and tutorials to learn more about the details on how I did something or how others are doing it. So let's move on. We want to talk about materials next. They are also important, and essentially they are what makes your experience look great. And materials make use of UV maps that we talked about just now. And so let's go back to Blender, and we still have our cylinder. And in Unity, you might have noticed when you import a mesh, then you select it, then you usually, if you go into the importer settings under materials, you will have a selection of material slots where you can map your Unity materials onto that object, because there's with FBX, for example, and OBJ object 3D assets, there's no way really, even with GLB, there is not really a way to transfer material information from one engine to the other, because every engine has a different sorts of material language. So only because something looks the way you want it in Blender doesn't mean once you import it into Unity that it will look exactly the same as it did in Blender. So that's why you create the materials in Unity, and then you have to map them onto these slots of on the object. But as you can see here, when imported into Unity, this cylinder actually doesn't even have any material slots because we haven't created any. So if you now go into Blender and select the object, and down here select material properties, you can see it's empty up here as well. So let's create a new material and call it, I don't know, default cylinder material. This is not a good name. Usually you should come up with something descriptive that better describes the type of surface we are looking at, but this is good for now. So I could now go ahead and make this, for example, red in Blender, and if I switch to material preview rendering, then we can see this cylinder is now red because it's fully covered in red material, which is the default cylinder material. And now if I go and export this again, FBX, export, and in Unity, I actually delete this and import the new cylinder again, then see this time it imported and it's actually already red. So we do get some base information here from Blender that it's a reddish material, and Unity imported that and understood that and made the cylinder red. And now you can see that when we select the asset in Unity, we actually see default cylinder material as a material slot. And that means we can now go ahead and create a Unity material like this, red cylinder. And then now we can select the cylinder and map our Unity material red cylinder onto that material slot and tell Unity, whenever using that material of the object, please use this Unity material. And since our red cylinder material is still the defaults, it isn't even red. So let's make it red. We can make it red here. We can actually make it more metallic in Unity and stuff. We can reduce smoothness, increase smoothness to make it look the way we want it to look, and maybe the way it looked in Blender. But after importing into Unity, it wasn't just there. So we now have to tweak a little bit. We could add some albedo. Let's do that actually. So I still have my Substance Painter open that we created just a minute ago too. So let's go and select File, Export Textures, and then we will export all of the textures. Open Output Directory. So, and I will actually just take the base map like this, and actually take the normal map as well. So now I imported those textures we created in Substance Painter into Unity. Now select the red cylinder material and apply the albedo here and the normal map right here. And as you can see, Unity is going to complain we haven't marked that normal map texture as a normal map yet. We can fix that right away. And look at that. We actually get to see the drawings we made on the cylinder, the scratches, and so on. So maybe make it like this, so it's more visible, and make it in a bright red, like this. I don't know. It's not really important, but you get the idea. So now we have made use of our UV maps that we created for this cylinder. We imported the textures, and we are now able to make the object look the way we want it in Unity. If we didn't know ourselves about UV maps and UV mapping and unwrapping, there's no way we can do that on our own as a developer. But now that we have the tool set, we can do these kind of basic things on our own. Of course, when you have a, I don't know, AAA character, it's a whole different story in terms of complexity. But at the end, it's the same procedures, it's the same things happening. That's why I keep using these simple geometries, because there's no point in working on a complex object right now. It will just distract you from the fact that it's all the same principles applied. Yeah, so we now have a cylinder, we have a material slot that we apply to it, and that's great. And we are making use of the UV map that we created in Blender. We are using the texture that we created in Substance Painter, for example. And so that way we can just create our own assets and make them look the way we want them. Of course, we didn't talk about modeling itself and how to modify geometry and, I don't know, create whatever shape you want, but that's way too much for this session to cover, so I didn't even bother adding it. It's just something that you can get started doing while learning about these other things. Yeah, so one thing I want to talk about as well is material slots count. So when you think about performance and such, the more of these material slots your geometry has, the more expensive it is to render, right? So I can add to one object multiple materials. I can actually make this, so let's rename them first. I'm gonna rename this one green, this one brown, and this one yellow, and assign the colors down here. I don't know, brownish, and this one's green. And now I can say, okay, this face right here, it's green. Assign that material. I can assign brown right here. And I can assign, what do I have left? Yellow right here. So now this is a very beautiful object that has 4 material slots. And this is actually producing more draw calls on the GPU than needed. So we could fix this. If we want this cylinder for some reason to be green, yellow, brown, and red, we can just create 1 material slot, right, instead of 4, and use a texture that paints those individual faces in the color we want to have. And that way we still have multiple colors, but we are just using 1 material for it, right? It's just 1 material slot that we are using, and it's a great way to optimize your objects. So always think about, do I really need multiple material slots for this object, or can I maybe reduce it to 1 material that has a texture that paints the different colors on the faces that I want to have, or the different details, right? So that's just a simple way of improving things, and using what we learned today, you are already able to do that on your own, right? That's it, folks. We are at the end. I actually had to cut out a few pieces to make it in time, but I still think that I was able to cover a lot of the basics. As I said, it was fast and it was a lot, so make sure to get more details as you need them. Please feel free to leave me some questions in the Discord, or get in touch via Twitter or whatever you like, where I'm available. I'm more than happy to give some more details on certain topics you have questions about and help out. We have covered 3D basics, vertices, edges, faces, quads, normals, and so on and so forth. So once you absorb those terms and you're familiar with those, you already have the knowledge of how a 3D object is made up of. Then you have UV maps and you know how to make your things beautiful using textures and UV maps. And then you know how to use all of that for materials to give it that final touch and make the things really beautiful in Unity and apply all of that. As I said, please drop me some questions, and thank you for watching and listening, and have a great time.